Humanities here at Columbia. Many thanks to all those who have returned after our brief hiatus in solidarity with the recent graduate student strike. We are so glad to have you with us as we resume our series tonight. So tonight's panel is titled Telling Stories, Medicine and Institutional Racism. It builds on the theme of our series opening keynote by Ari Heinrich, which explored the long history of anti-Asian bias and pandemic. Tonight, we'll consider how medicine and health can reveal the fractures and fissures of our society, most especially the problems of racism and racial bias. Tonight's event is supported by the Department of Medical Humanities and Ethics at Columbia University Irving Medical Center. Our moderator is Dr. Rita Charon, chair of the department and the founder of the field of narrative medicine. And she will begin by introducing our panelists. Welcome, Dr. Charon.
Thank you, Arden. And I hope all of you were able to hear enough of that intro to know that this is part of the ongoing series to celebrate and initiate the new major in medical humanities. So this is part of a series in urban pandemics. And I was thinking as looking forward to this, which urban are we talking about? Which city are we talking about? As we discuss stories from medicine and race. And I think on one hand, we're talking about Columbia. Many of you may know that the so-called downtown at Columbia is 116th Street, which seems odd to many people, which is the Arts and Sciences campus. And uptown is at 168th Street in Washington Heights, where the Health Sciences Center lives. And there's rarely congress between those two, although we're trying to make that happen more. So one of the urbans we're talking about is indeed Upper Manhattan. But another urban that we're talking about is medicine writ large, the whole continent of medicine and healthcare. And I think that's maybe the urban that we're more able to address tonight by virtue of the tremendous guests that we have to talk with you about it. I will introduce our first speaker, and I will introduce the others as their turn comes. Bettina Judd is Assistant Professor of Gender, Women, and Sexuality Studies at the University of Washington in Seattle. She is an interdisciplinary writer, artist, and performer whose forthcoming book, Feelin', Creative Practice, Pleasure Politics, and Black Feminist Thought, is on Black women's creative production and our use of visual art, literature, and music to develop Black feminist thought. Her first collection of poems on the history of medical experimentation on Black women, entitled Patient, won the 2013 Black Lawrence Press Hudson Book Prize. Her essays and poetry can be found in Feminist Studies, Meridians, Torch, The Rumpus, The Offing, and other journals and anthologies. The title of her lecture tonight is To Be the Moral Mandate, Black Feminist Medical Narrative. And I welcome Professor Judd to our space.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here with folks. I look forward to the conversation that will no doubt be riveting after these presentations. So I currently find myself fixed to tarry with the fields of Black feminist thought, disability studies, and history of medicine as these folks in these fields engage issues around medical ethics, practice, and science. And trust me, I want to shake loose some of these topics because I did not intend to continue to think about medical racism in my work. The larger trajectory of my work, so I thought, was about Black women's creative production as visual artists, musicians, and poets, as was stated in my bio. But I keep returning to this topic, perhaps because of the kind of attention that patient has received, which I'm grateful for. And because of the salience of the themes in patient that have had some resurgence due to recent events. The challenge of our collective memory as it relates to textbooks and monuments, i.e., how we teach the history of slavery and medicine, and how we honor and make monuments of Confederate figures such as J. Marion Sims. And the not yet ceasing nor dwindling crisis of Black maternal and infant mortality, the opioid epidemic, and the racial codes that it reveals about the medical system. One, that Black people are more criminalized for addiction and also underattended to in matters of pain treatment. And of course, the moment that we find ourselves in now, COVID-19 and the inequities of medical care access, and the so-called comorbidities experienced by Black folks. And we can go on and on about what that looks like and sounds like. And all of these are incredibly important issues in which the book has a stake. And I think it's that a lot of people who might not think of poetry and a book of poems as having a stake in much of anything, much less medical racism, kind of says something about why I'm interested in the folks in the fields that I just talked about at the outset. But I am thinking with them. And so here's a little mind map that I have set, that I've been sitting with, specifically related to 4 texts. And it's scholars like Dorothy Roberts, whose Fatal Invention asks us to pause and evaluate our investments in the scientific notion of race. It's Deirdre Cooper Owens, whose book, Medical Apartheid, offers us the term super bodies to describe the work expected of enslaved Black women as medical specimens, as well as laborers within the system of the medical plantation. It's the work of Izetta Autumn-Mobley and Moya Bailey, whose recent article proposes a Black feminist disability studies framework, and Carla F.C. Holloway, whose Public Bodies, Private Texts, or Private Bodies, Public Texts, offers a literary and legal framework for thinking about how Black women's creative knowledge production can inform medical and legal discourse through what she calls cultural bioethics. So I brainstorm these 4 concepts here: super bodies, the fatal invention of race, Black feminist disability frameworks, and cultural bioethics. And I mapped out these concepts to dig for what they were trying to teach me about this moment. And I made the following connections. To be the moral mandate, to always be the one working at it, to be the gutted and the one to stitch your wounds, the wounds of others and the wounds of the oppressor, to be the great example so that learning can happen, to be the first to die on the table, to be an archive of discounted memory, to be the only one to remember and to wither from that memory, to want for something otherwise, to piece together some of what we have learned, to be discredited, to die, to live anyway, to be honored posthumously for the thing you knew and said when you were living. This mind map isn't meant to be cute or fancy. It was quite literally a way for me to make sense of a set of connections I'm trying to make, and I'm not quite there yet. So following, maybe our discussion can kind of build off of it here. I'm seeing clear connections between and across the text, bound by discipline and necessarily the individual texts themselves are interdisciplinary. And what that teaches me is something I already knew and said to some extent in the book Patient, but didn't understand how much more magnified the sentiment needed to be. The statement I said was a statement that I personally blurted out in my own kind of ordeal with medicine at Johns Hopkins Hospital in the emergency room. And that statement was, gynecology was built on the backs of Black women. What the sentiment needed to possibly be, or what the larger statement that that me saying that meant, particularly as if we think about the moment, I am a medical patient. I am under a lot of, I'm under duress. I am also supposed to be a lot more calm for the amount of drugs that I had in my system, for the amount of, pain medication that I had in my system. But I said this thing anyway. I invoked history anyway. And so the statement really is Western medical science, its infrastructure, its buildings, its wealth, its station as the most valuable of knowledge was built on the backs of Black women, Indigenous women, women of color, particularly the poor. And Black women's knowledge production from Anarcha, Betsy and Lucy and Joyce to now has offered otherwise ways of knowing healing work within what some of us might call the medical industrial complex. And what counters these logics is embodied and creative knowledge. And what all of these scholars that I mentioned here seem to agree upon is that we challenge notions of what we understand as value knowledge for something more whole. Nothing other than, of course, the indomitable Audre Lorde demonstrates this more in her collection of short essays and journal entries, the Cancer Journals. In this entry dated March 25th, 1978, she says, "The idea of knowing rather than believing, trusting, or even understanding has always been considered heretical, but I would willingly pay whatever price and pain was needed to savor the weight of completion, to be utterly filled, not with conviction nor with faith, but with experience, knowledge, direct and different from all other certainties." And what's interesting is she continues in this next quote from an entry in her journals from October 10th, 1978. "I want to write about the pain of waking up in the recovery room, which is worsened by that immediate sense of loss, of going in and out of pain and shots, of the correct position for my arm to drain, the euphoria of the second day and how it's been downhill from there. I want to write of the pain I'm feeling right now, of the lukewarm tears that will not stop coming into my eyes. And for what? For my lost breath? For the lost me? And which me was that again anyway? For the death I don't know how to postpone or how to meet elegantly? I'm so tired of all of this. I want to be the person I used to be, the real me. I feel sometimes that it's all a dream, and surely I'm about to wake up now." And so what Lorde is asking for, a way to write, a way to know that would be more whole, would possibly be a way to write all of the ways that we think the things that we think that we know in order to embrace otherwise disregarded knowledge. There's a phrase that is, common, if you go to, or if you're in a particular generation or sit around a particular generation of US Black folks, particularly if they're in the church, and that is the phrase, "I know that I know that I know." Right? A way of knowing that casts out the regimes of knowledge that maintain the fatal invention of race, that frame the common scientific sense that seems to enforce that Black people, and certainly Black women, are prone to dying earlier and more than others. And this is not newly discovered knowledge. It's old, but it's knowledge disregarded, devalued for the dominance of racial logics. And there's a tradition of this kind of intervention. And I won't get into it too deeply here for the sake of time. I'm going to read from my book, Patient, but includes writers such as Audre Lorde and Lucille Clifton. Even Toni Morrison's Home addresses this. Nikki Finney's The Greatest Show on Earth, and Zora Neale Hurston. It includes musicians and visual artists as well. And writing Patient was an effort to be a part of a longer tradition of acknowledging the way that I know that I know that I know. So I'll start with this poem, What I Know That I Know That I Know. So history has attempted to rebrand J. Marion Sims at various points in times. There have been debates about his use of anesthesia, that he simply didn't have access to anesthesia, that it wasn't common enough at the time, or that he did in fact anesthetize these women, that he might have actually intentionally addicted them to opium. These are different theories about his whether or not he at all attended to their pain. But Sims' own records reveal how improbable it is that his subjects were given substantial pain management and surgery, as he describes his preferred position for examination and surgery regarding the female pelvis here on page 13 of his clinical notes on uterine surgery. And so this is a video poem or poems that focus on that page here. The diagram that you see in front of you, this right triangle, is meant to be a diagram of a woman. It is found in clinical notes on uterine surgery. You can access it through Google Books. It's in the public domain. And I will play this video. Geometry and Calculus, with a run-on sentence from page 13 of J. Marion Sims' Clinical Notes on Uterine Surgery. Many persons who have never witnessed the use of my speculum doubt the correctness of my explanation of its rationale as given above. But let such experiment for themselves and give us a rationale more in accordance with the laws of natural philosophy, if they have one. For a successful experiment, certain conditions are requisite. At the risk of being tedious, I will reiterate them. Let the experimenter first loosen all the strings and fastenings of the dress and corsets, and then place the patient on a table on her knees and bend her body forward.
The calculus of
till the
us.
head is brought down.
Dear Joyce, my fate and yours an arithmetic. Correct me if I'm wrong, but the function of slave equals canary, where canary means recurring death. If this is true, you too were experiment, your exposed brain to my contained urine. Of these things we are both cured. The function of cure equals elimination, preservation. There is honey in never returning to fields, salt in 35 operations, your dissection, subjection. The function of subject equals conscious mind, ego, autobiographical retraction, are ghosts in the stories, slippery abolitionist showman, coward Confederate
Thighs are to be
doctor.
separated 8 or 10 inches. The thighs are to be at about right angles with the table. Thus, the plane of the table, AB, the axis of the thighs, AC, and that of the body, CB, would form a right-angled triangle, of which the thighs and table...
Square and compass, or Joyce posthumously reflects on the geometry of the showman's recollection. 1. Square the right angle between one leg that cannot move, one that will not. Bisect with your horror. Proof. Empty breasts, hungry mouths. 2. Diameter distance between Boston and Alabama. Proof. Bill of sale. 3. Find the radius to Anarcha. Look legs first. Proof. Showman is doctor. Doctor is showman. 4. Tangent is history.
To be the moral mandate is not sustainable or truly possible. It assumes power and is thus cruel. And Black women's history with cruel science is logical within the framework of knowledge as we know it. It's logical within the frameworks by which medical science is bound. To use Black women's history as a moral mandate against it is to trot out suffering with little to no intention to cure. And I think of Dr. Susan Moore here, how her acute knowledge of the medical science that is valued was also disregarded despite her profession, how her final effort to speak to her experience of medical racism was to tell her story, but it should not take us telling our horror stories, speaking from our deathbed, for us to rethink what we think we know. To adhere to the idea that Black women be a kind of moral mandate is another function of the concept of the super body, by which so much work is expected of Black women in the medical situation. To acknowledge and value ways of knowing disregarded and devalued and start our modes of inquiry from that place is where I'd like to begin. And so I'll continue this reading of poems from Patient with this concept of the moral mandate in mind. And, hopefully with the intent to shift our approach to knowledge, poems that I think speak to that in some way from the manuscript. The researcher contemplates Venus. When I talk about my work, I'm asked to speak of Sarki Wortman. I take Sarki's hand and ask her, "Where would you like for me to put you?" She laughs, or maybe she sighs. Researchers only ask leading questions that lean toward the body, sometimes trip over the dead. This is Suicide of 100,000 Its, and this is a page from J. Marion Sims's Autobiography where he narrates a case of infant lockjaw. It had been in spasms for 2 days and nights and looked as if it were dying. Touching it would throw it into convulsions. Laying it on its face would cause spasms. Any noise would produce them. It could not swallow, could take no nourishment, and it was impossible for it to suck. It was covered with a cold, clammy perspiration. Its hands were tightly clenched so that the fingernails were almost cutting into the flesh on the palms of its hands. As a matter of course, the child died. The next day, we held a post-mortem examination. Dear doctor, go to the source of the suffering. This is why I could not grow, why I would not eat, why I cut into my own flesh, refused to be touched. This is why I crawled inside myself and died, as a matter of course. This is How to Measure Pain, and you'll see this image. It's if you've seen the book, you might notice that this is kind of the pan out of the cover of the book. It is a pastel and collage piece that I created along with the process of writing Patient. It's called How to Measure Pain 1. It's not necessarily meant to be illustrative of this particular poem. They just have the same name, or they have a similar name. In The Woman, it is a checklist. Can you imagine anything worse than this? If the answer is no, ask again. Initiation Memory, late evening, February 16th, 2006. Gynecology was built on the backs of Black women anyway. Hospital curtain, showman's speculum, surgeon's auditorium. There is an opening here, thrusting a climax, a little death. Who will rise from that? And how? Why not stay dead and forget? Why do I choose to remember you in bed with me, Anarcha? You brushing my head, Joyce. Why do you mourn me and sing as if I am the one who has died? And on the politics of citation, so the book often cited for the way that it treats Anarcha, Betsy, and Lucy, but it also talks about Joyce Heth and has a few poems about Esme Green, who folks who are, you know, have a long memory of New York might remember, was intending to be a patient at Kings County Hospital, hospital, and waited for many, many hours and simply died on the emergency room floor there. Esmeen Green, the thought that perhaps this is a metaphor for how we all die. Green, an idea of metaphors that live where bodies cannot. Some things were left when she died on that Kings County emergency room floor, her body and who else? Open parentheses, Green, close parentheses, her name now locked in a line. The line is no one noticed. It continues, differentiate me from death. And this poem is called After Memory. It, in my mind, comes after the poem Initiation Memory, where that blurring out of gynecology was built on the backs of Black women. What happens after that? The kind of passive aggressive, oh, did we do something to offend you? Response that kind of speaking invites, I suppose. And the epigraph is from a poem by Lucille Clifton, where she was poet laureate of the state of Maryland for a time, and so was asked to, write, and was tasked with the job of writing these occasional poems, the opening or the, commemoration of a historical site or any of those sorts of things. And so, like many poets who are asked by the state to do such commemorations, particularly if they are Black in the US, there's kind of an ask there to remember someone else's memories. And the poem goes, they ask me, the poem is titled, Why Some People Be Mad at Me Sometimes. And the poem is, they ask me to remember their memories, in the line here, but I keep remembering mine. It's like when a Black person says, that's racist, to a white person and they refuse to believe. Maybe it's better to say this moment is steeped in a racist history. This racist history is indelibly printed on my memory. You don't want to remember, so you wish to erase mine. But it is not heard. One only hears what one hopes not to be, and that's racist. After memory, I am absent. No table. No one on all fours, no children living or otherwise, no hymns, no nursemaids, no sideshow freaks, no experiments, no spoon, no bent handle, no wincing, just whiskey, opium, and now wasn't there some good? This is the last poem I'll read from Patient, You Be Lucy, I'll Be Betsy, February 17th, 2006. The nurse with the natural compliments me on my locks. We began in that nappy hair banter. When did you start yours? All of this happening between my thighs. Between speculum and cotton swab, I just had to stop running to the salon. Between the manual test and the vagina, you're going to feel a pinch. And the manual test and the anus, it's so much easier to manage this way. Nothing said of my outburst, nothing about the angry patient on this floor. Yours looks so healthy. Nothing about why she tends to me after that. Almost done. Just two Black women and a speculum, each asking the other, when did you get free? And I will end there.
Thank you, Professor Judd. Thank you for bringing all of this to our sight and ears. We will have time toward the end of the evening to talk about the epistemology and the aesthetics, how you so exquisitely force them into not a conversation, but a demand for one another. Thank you. I will introduce to you Dr. Raymond Givens. Dr. Givens is an assistant professor in the Department of Medicine and Associate Director of the Cardiac Intensive Care Unit at Columbia University Irving Medical Center. He completed fellowships in cardiology and advanced heart failure and transplant at New York Presbyterian Columbia and joined the Columbia faculty in 2016. His research uses spatial analysis to examine the impacts of neighborhood factors and urban policies on health risks and outcomes. And because Dr. Givens and I are colleagues in the Department of Medicine, I can add that it was Dr. Givens who made sure that the discovery that one of our heroes at the medical center, the founder of the medical school, was indeed himself a slave owner. And Dr. Givens will perhaps tell us some of what happened as he brought that knowledge to us all. Dr. Givens.
Thank you, Dr. Charon. Thank you all for having me. I think I should start by acknowledging the time in which we're meeting. Certainly the past year has been, really unprecedented, and it's certainly stressful for everyone. I think some of us have borne the stress more than others have. It is something that, as the police officer who murdered George Floyd is on trial in Minneapolis, within the past few days, another Black man is killed by police in the Minneapolis area. And that really just, reminds me that history sometimes is self-referential. It goes in circles, and perhaps if there's something we didn't learn about things the first time, we're not being presented with it again. And I think I would suggest that there's a lot that we have purposefully ignored from the first murder that we saw in Minneapolis nearly a year ago. To set the stage for how I got here, obviously it was, maybe 13 and a half months ago that the first case of COVID-19 appeared in New York City, and shortly thereafter appeared in our cardiac intensive care units. And, within short order, it just, everything exploded. And it was, often our, units, really looked like war zones. It was an environment that most of us had never been in. It was extraordinarily uncomfortable to be in a position where these patients were just dropping dead. And often it didn't seem like there was anything you could do to help them. And certainly, one thing that was inescapable, especially in this neighborhood, Washington Heights, is that nearly, the vast majority of those people who were killed or gravely injured by this outbreak were Black or brown people. And that's a pattern that has been, replicated across the country. And when George Floyd was murdered, really on the heels of that, it took me a while to recognize that something broke in me and pushed me to do some very crazy things since then. Maybe I'll start with, kind of the longer history of me, of my family, which is that I'm from the South. Grew up in initially in St. Petersburg, Florida. And I wasn't born in the South, but, really spent all of my upbringing there. And, my mother was a single mother. My grandmother and my aunt helped raise me. My mother's paternal grandparents, they had come to Florida originally from a farm in Georgia. And the thing that I don't think I got as a kid that I didn't dawn on me until adulthood is that they probably were sharecroppers. And which would explain perhaps something that my mother told me, when I was in grade school, which is that she was working hard. She wanted to make sure that we never had to live in a place named for a plantation. And, across the South, even still in other parts of the country, that's a common finding. Place names referencing plantations, housing communities named plantation estates, plantation arms apartments, everywhere. Even as a kid, I think I understood that meant she was trying to protect my dignity. She remembered from her youth in St. Petersburg, separate water fountains for white and colored people. My grandmother, her mother, told me about a city named Quincy, Florida, where she had been for some time previously in her life. And at one time there was a sign in Quincy that read, "Niggers don't let the sun set on you in this town." That's the text, the backdrop of my childhood. My mother and my younger sister and I moved to Atlanta before I started high school. And it wasn't until the summer before college that I met my father for the first time. I went on to the University of Georgia, which, this was actually the second oldest public university in America. And despite Black Georgians supporting this university for decades with their tax money, it wasn't integrated until the early 60s under court order. I graduated from Georgia, got a medical degree at Duke and a PhD from University of North Carolina School of Public Health. Did my residency at Johns Hopkins, and then in 2011 came to New York City to do a cardiology fellowship at Columbia. So my wife and I, we moved into an apartment building at the corner of West 170th Street and Haven Avenue in Washington Heights, a couple blocks from the hospital. And from our kitchen window, I could see a sign for a building named Bard Hall. I didn't know who Bard was, but I, later realized that the chair of my department, medicine, carried the title of Samuel Bard Professor of Medicine. And when I was a fellow, I actually received the Samuel Bard Young Investigator Award for my research. I came to understand that, Dr. Bard founded Columbia's medical school, which is actually the second in America after University of Pennsylvania, the first in the country to award the MD degree. He also founded the predecessor of New York Presbyterian Hospital. In 2014, August 2014, my first son, whose name is Lucas, he was born a few weeks after the cell phone video of Eric Garner being choked to death on Staten Island was publicized. And, in the delivery suite, actually, we were watching news coverage from Ferguson, Missouri, after Michael Brown was killed and his body laid in the street for, hours. I was struck with tremendous fear about how I was going to keep my son safe. But I said, I would do everything that I could. I would, whatever it took, give him every opportunity. I finished my fellowship in general cardiology, went on and did a fellowship in advanced heart failure and transplant. Then I joined the Columbia faculty in 2016. And around then, actually the year before, the Colombian Slavery Project had debuted. This was, likely prompted. So Columbia, certainly among the Ivy League universities, was not the first to do a project like this. Brown University had done it, more than a decade before. Notably, I think it's relevant here that Brown at that time was headed by a Black woman, Ruth Simmons. In 2013, a historian, professor of history at MIT, Craig Stephen Wilder, published a book, Ebony and Ivy, about the history of elite colleges, and really laying out that by and large, elite American education was built on slavery, either being financed through profits derived from slavery, or having early presidents who owned slaves or slaves building the campus. And Columbia was no exception. And in that book, in that 2013 book, was a passage that revealed this information about Samuel Bard, that he owned slaves and that he was memorialized with this professorship at Columbia. After I joined faculty around that time, a colleague mentioned that information to me. That's something I hadn't known before. And he'd learned that from the Columbian Slavery Project website. I should mention that the Columbian Slavery Project debuted this was spearheaded by Columbia University President Lee Bollinger with the assistance of Eric Foner. It's relevant here that Craig Stephen Wilder, who wrote the Ebony and Ivy book, got his PhD in history at Columbia, and Eric Foner was one of his advisors. In 2014, they brought him to campus to talk about the book. In 2015, they launched the project. So learning this about Dr. Bard was maybe a bit uncomfortable for all the reasons that I've laid out, having to do with my connections, I suppose, at that point with that name. But I kept quiet. I didn't want to provoke retaliation. I was just joining faculty. And, another notable thing about that time is that the project had debuted around the same time that a white supremacist killed 9 worshipers at Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston, South Carolina. That actually renewed calls at Yale University to change the name of Calhoun College. So Calhoun College was a dormitory that memorialized John Calhoun, who was a Yale graduate. He was a South Carolina native, U.S. Senator, the 7th U.S. Vice President, and a prolific slave owner and passionate advocate for slavery. And Yale President Peter Salovey announced that the Yale Corporation, which is its board of trustees, had decided that no, the name wouldn't be changed, that, reasons. So, interestingly, the next year, so this is 2016 now, a Black alumnus who had lived in that dormitory, came back to visit, wanted to see his old dorm. And the person who let him in was a man who was a dishwasher in the building. His name is Corey Menifee. And Mr. Menifee had been working in the building for some time, but he's nearsighted and didn't have glasses, and so had never noticed a detail that the alumnus pointed out to him, which was that in Calhoun College, there was a stained glass window depicting slaves carrying bales of cotton. This is 2016 at Yale University in a building where students live. A few days later, Corey Menifee took a broomstick, climbed up on a table and smashed the window. Yale had him arrested and charged him with a felony. Under public pressure, they dropped the charges. And the next year, Peter Salovey, President Salovey, announced that that Calhoun College would be renamed. But his statement notably omitted Corey Menifee, who was the very clear catalyst for that change. In the intervening years since Columbia debuted its own slavery project, despite having received, despite President Bollinger, specifically having received really glowing press on, on prominent platforms, New York Times, NPR, Washington Post, et cetera, et cetera. I could see no evidence that the university had made any effort to address the findings of the project. But I continued to stay quiet because I had the job to protect. When my son Lucas was ready for nursery school, again, wanting to give him the best chance I could in life, we enrolled him in the best school that we could afford, and that's the Medical Center Nursery School, which happens to be on the 3rd floor of Bard Hall. And I took him there every day, knowing that I was taking him to a building named for somebody who would have seen him as property. And that was a tough thing to do. Last year changed everything. Again, it was, I became helpless after kind of witnessing, all of the events. And in early June, I submitted a question to outgoing medical school dean Lee Goldman about the Bard professorship in Bard Hall, and didn't get an answer, although I heard from another source that the message had been received and it was being discussed. On June 21st, a couple days after Juneteenth, an email was sent to the Columbia Heart Failure Group, which I had trained with, from congratulating a graduating fellow for quote unquote surviving the slave ship. It's notable here, I omitted that I am the only Black fellow that group is trained in at least a decade, perhaps ever. I knew that the person who sent that email, English is not their native language. They didn't grow up in America. That person is a very lovely person. I've never had a problem with them. I just assumed it was an honest mistake, and I still believe that. But experience informed my certainty that nobody in that group was going to say anything. That this was a moment where we had to stop and acknowledge the inappropriateness of this statement, to provide context to it. And they confirmed my expectations. And so I responded to them with a message that frankly excoriated them for what I've seen as a long history of indifference and inaction on hostile and bigoted behavior that actually has led me to not be a formal member of that group. And I got a flood of apologetic calls and emails and pledges that we're going to do better. We understand we have to do better, and then they didn't do anything. On June 23rd, I contacted the chair of medicine, Donald Landry, about the Bard Professorship in Bard Hall. And, what transpired after that was a fairly contentious back and forth about this. What I was told through another channel was that the word had gotten already to the desk of President Bollinger and to hospital leadership. And, by the end of that week, the chairman had announced that he was dropping the professorship. But what he told me was that as for Bard Hall, I was on my own. And so I approached President Bollinger directly and saying that, it was time to make this change. Outside of a brief email that thanked me for looking into it, I have gotten no other communication from him. That led to contacting the provost, the board of trustees, in July, and no responses. In July, mid-July, President Bollinger released a statement of Columbia's commitment to anti-racism while actively ignoring a Black faculty member. And in that statement, mentions that a few years ago, he started this Colombian slavery project and that he had begun a process of examining names of buildings and what should be done about them. And it became clear to me then that what would happen is that certainly this change was going to be made, but that I would be erased in the same way that Corey Menifee was erased at Yale. Which is why I began desperately kind of seeking media coverage to try to preempt this narrative. And I'll tell you, it was extraordinarily tough. But the New York Times story that came out on the day of the announcement was written by a reporter that I had been working with for some time. Bollinger's August 28th announcement said that he said the change felt urgent. And it confirmed my predictions that he would not mention me. I approached the president and the provost again without response. I was advised by someone from the ombuds office to file a report with the compliance office, which still has received no response. Messages to the associate general counsel and chief counsel of the university have also received no response. And in September, I filed a racial discrimination complaint with the Office of Equal Opportunity and Affirmative Action. We, having had a fact-finding meeting with the office in early December, my attorney and I requested informal resolution, just through a mediation session with Bollinger and Provost Katz Nelson, who's the interim provost and outgoing, and incoming provost Mary Boyce. President Bollinger has never responded to that request. Provost Katz Nelson declined mediation, but allowed that we could have some conversations, and we spoke over Zoom, and they were very pleasant conversations. It was great to meet him. I have his books on my shelf. Some of the history that he's done about the New Deal era informs my research on urban policy. But after emailing him or asking for follow-up, he's cut off communication. I say again that all of this occurs against the backdrop of having represented this university on the front lines fighting this pandemic. From the very beginning, when we were so frenzied, everybody we didn't know what this was. Everybody was afraid. You didn't know if you were infecting your family when you came home. But I showed up. A last-ditch attempt to just give my testimony before the University Senate was rebuffed because supposedly I'd started a process with EOAA and they couldn't do a parallel investigation, even though I said, well, the EOA process is stalled because the president refuses to respond. And at this point, I'm not asking for you to take action. I just want you to hear me, hear what I have to tell you about all of this. And they won't allow that. I was allowed a meeting with the Diversity Commission of the Senate to tell this story. What I would say is, I think there are a few better ways to dehumanize somebody than to act as if they don't exist. It's worth noting that, President Lee Bollinger is most known for as a very prominent advocate for diversity in higher education. As a named defendant in 2 pivotal Supreme Court cases having to do with his use of affirmative action at University of Michigan Law School and at University of Michigan. He's also well known as a very prominent expert on the First Amendment and freedom of speech. So I think this treatment has been shocking, to be quite frank. The president has claimed my story as his own. And, ironically, that's at a university named for Christopher Columbus. I'd say that for a student, that might lead to a discussion of the honor code. The president surely understands the history that this behavior evokes. And why is he doing it? I don't know. I don't know his mind, and that doesn't interest me. But speaking about the behavior, is he a racist? I don't know. I don't have that suspicion. But I would say about the behavior, it is aggressively racist, knowingly racist. A man of his education surely knows times in our country when Black people couldn't speak for themselves in court. They had to have a white person speak on their behalf. They couldn't testify against white people. Sometime after I met my father, he showed me a name on his family tree. It's a direct ancestor who was a white man. And 23andMe confirms that my Y chromosome is European. And it shows his name. I know his name. But the mother of his children, is only listed as slave woman. And I think about her sometimes. I think about that she would have been shocked to know that one of her descendants would one day be a physician and a faculty member at a prominent university. But to know that he could be erased and made nameless, I don't think would have surprised her. I'll just say that the experience has been harmful, and I'm not alone. Many Black physicians have really been traumatized over the past year. I've sought help for it. One other thing that, just a couple other things, finishing notes. I'd say that the president hasn't just withheld the truth; he's withheld peace from me. The ability to sleep, the ability to know that things have been settled. But in the course of trying to understand this behavior, I began to hear the stories of sex assault survivors
Mhm.
and the obstruction that they say that they face from the university. That former executive vice president for University of Life, Suzanne Goldberg, was at the center of much of that. And there's actually a documentary being made called Deliberately Indifferent that features her. If you go to the website, deliberatelyindifferent.com, you can see the trailer. Suzanne Goldberg is now notably Deputy Secretary in the Office of Civil Rights, the U.S. Department of Education. So her office would be involved in investigating Title IX complaints and civil rights complaints coming from Columbia University. I am extraordinarily concerned about the health and safety of young women who attend this university, of African Americans and other marginalized people who cannot get justice. And I worry about my ability to fulfill my duty to report every year I have to certify that if I suspect that someone has been a victim of harassment or abuse or assault, that I have a duty to report that to the university. It's a difficult thing to do when I can't trust that that person won't be abused by the system in the very same way. I'm alarmed that there appears to be no separation between the office of the president in any grievance mechanism at this university. It's notable that striking grad student workers, beyond asking for a higher living wage, are concerned about the sexual assault response system and are asking for an independent, arbitrary, neutral arbitration. Let me just end by coming back to the idea that history references itself. And talk about another way that I feel connected to the story of Dr. Samuel Bard. He was born in Philadelphia and in the 1700s, and his family, moved away. He became a doctor and then came to New York City. He founded Columbia University Medical Center. In 1776, he placed an ad in the New York Gazette that offered $10 for the return of a runaway slave named James. 200 years later, I was born in Philadelphia. My family moved away. I became a physician. I moved to New York City to live literally in the shadow of a building named for that man. In the year that I asserted my own independence at a university for which the first, 6 or 7 presidents were slave owners. In the year that I stood up, the president of Columbia started running for me, and he's dragged the whole university with him. And, I think we've seen it as recently as January 6th, the danger of failing to take a stand against abusive leaders. I know this before I started, but the Columbia's alma mater is Stand Columbia, and that's the thing that I think the university has not done. I tell all of that to really highlight if that happens at a place like this, if that's the resistance, it frankly seems almost hopeless that we make progress in a punctuated way, not just in due time, but not just sitting around and waiting for another however many Black people to be killed by police and another tens of thousands to be killed by coronavirus before we say, oh, now we really have to do something.
Yes. Thank you.
I'll end there.
You've given us such a charge, Dr. Givens. I don't know even what to call what you have just given us. It's not only a trauma narrative. It's not only an autobiographical accounting. It is an accounting against, what did we call it at the beginning? This urban, this university, which is that stands for the entire country. I appreciate that you felt able to tell us about that which you have been through. I think that many in our audience here will have many questions. I think we'll be able to connect up much of what you said with Professor Judd's frameworks of to know that you know that you know. I'm going to invite Matthew Sandler to give some comments now. And then we will have time for Professors Judd and Givens to ask one another questions. Those of you in the audience, please put questions you would like us to pose to either speaker in the Q&A, not the chat, the Q&A. Matthew Sandler has a PhD in English from Columbia. After graduate school, he taught at Louisiana State University, Gettysburg College, University of Oregon, and then has returned to Columbia. His recent work has appeared in African American Review, Atlantic Studies, Callaloo, Comparative Literature, and 20th Century Literature. His book, The Black Romantic Revolution, Abolition Poetics in the Civil War Era and Beyond, was just published. Please, Professor Sandler.
Thanks for that, Rita, and thanks so much to Professors Judd and Givens for those urgent and powerfully moving presentations. I'm not sure that we need me to frame this out at great length. I think, as Rita said, the parallels are clear. But I guess I have a couple of things I want to raise and hopefully contextualize for folks in the audience. So I'm here because I wrote this book about the poets of the abolition movement. And I work in a field called American Studies and African American Studies, Black Studies. So I think kind of in contextual terms about the poetry that I examined. And so in the spirit of that, I guess I want to just point out basically kind of three, what I think of as I've been listing as three kind of contested terrains on which these two presentations sort of are enacted. One is poetry, and I guess I want to mention or elaborate the kind of contested character of poetry as a terrain. So I'm thinking about thinking in my work in the 19th century, I'm thinking about a word that they used to think about lyric poetry was also minstrelsy. And the word minstrelsy is related to the word to minister, right? So that the idea of being a singing minstrel has contained in it kind of etymologically the principle of care, actually. But at the same time, we associate the history of minstrelsy in the 19th century with the popular form of blackface minstrelsy. So that poetry was both this thing that played the role in my research of liberatory kind of abolition, but that liberatory abolition came, in the context of poetry also being a kind of white racist form, poetry and lyrics being a kind of white racist form. And just to mark that, I want to offer a name for you from my research, a poet by the name of Joshua McCarter Simpson, who worked in the 1850s, 1860s in Ohio, and he's listed in the Oberlin, he was an alum of Oberlin College. He's listed in the alumni directory of Oberlin College as an herbalist. And his work, what he did was he rewrote the lyrics to minstrel songs and national anthems to be anti-slavery songs. So I'm going to just read one to you now, just to give you a sense of the kind of ambivalence of poetry, this kind of contested space. And in the spirit of the moment that we're in, people that Professor Givens and Judd have already called attention to. This is called Song of the Aliened American. I'll just read a teeny bit of it so you get the idea. My country, 'tis of thee, dark land of slavery, in thee we groan. Long have our chains been worn, Long has our grief been borne. Our flesh has long been torn, even from our bones. So just that kind of the contestation in the lyric there, I want to pick up on. Then theme 2, contested theme 2, is just medicine and care. And we've got on the table a kind of bibliography of medical racism in the form of Dorothy Roberts' book, which was mentioned earlier, and Deirdre Cooper Owens' excellent book also. I just wanted to add into that, there's a literature on slave medicine, so the medical practices that were brought from West Africa to the American South. Books by Charla Fett called Working Cures, Londa Schiebinger, The Secret Cures of Slaves, and Herbert Covey, African American Slave Medicine. So if you're interested in kind of thinking about forms of medical practice that are outside of, sort of non-Western, it might be interesting to think about kind of Black and enslaved forms of care in this context, which I think the poem by Professor Judd, with which she ended, really kind of starts to do some of that. And then the last contested space I think that we're kind of operating in here, which on the one hand, again, it's profoundly ambivalent because it provides the space for us to have this conversation, right? Look, the liberal ideal of contestation is alive, right? But the university, right? And the university, the university is both this place in which those liberal ideals are enacted, and it's also a site of, as Professor Givens especially pointed out, it's a site of exploitation, and discrimination and dispossession. And Professor Givens pointed out Craig Stephen Wilder's excellent book, Ebony and Ivory, about the history of slavery as embedded in the kind of history of these university spaces. I would also just add to that list DeVarian Baldwin's book, which has just come out, in the Shadow of the Ivory Tower, which is about the role of universities in contemporary urban life. And in particular about the ways that universities function as quote unquote as engines for economic development. But Baldwin's book is invested in kind of demonstrating the ways in which that economic development is actually all about, or built into, or kind of structured around the kind of dispossession, displacement, and kind of expropriation of especially Black communities. So those 3 points, kind of poetry is contested, medicine and care is contested, and the university is a contested space. So if you guys have things to say about that, that would be really awesome. But really, mostly thank you, because that was really beautiful, and I'm so glad to be here.
Wow, thank you.
Thank you.
Professor Judd, Givens, do you have questions for one another before we open to the floor? Or comments on one another's presentations?
I guess I do have to Professor Givens in the main.
Please, you just call me Ray. It's
Ray.
Yes.
And it's not my apology necessary to give, but to give as empathetic solidarity. To say that I see you, to say I'm sorry, as in witness, for the ways that institutions not only trot all over us, but then also have us questioning ourselves. And so I'm grateful for the work that you did and that you continue to do, no doubt. And many generations will be grateful for your work. And it's unfortunate. I mean, it's easy to like, shrug it off, but to have monuments to that which has for generations harmed us as Black folks, to be a part of trying to topple those things down, and to then face the very structure that makes it logical that they would stand in the first place in response.
Yeah.
And I just want to witness to the fact that I see that's what you described you experiencing here. Right.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And I certainly appreciate what you shared, and obviously mentioning that you've been to Johns Hopkins.
From Baltimore.
You're from Baltimore. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Wow. So I was there from 2008 through 2011. Yeah, it's a great learning experience. Obviously, that was a place that felt very overwhelming, just in terms of, because just naked disparity. Disparity seems almost like an inadequate word, and the whole history of centuries of like relentless racism just laid out before you. But I spent a lot of time thinking about Henrietta Lacks, of course, and there was a time when I somehow had this heady idea about the history of the body, and specifically of Black bodies, and in a kind of tragic but maybe also kind of poetic way, it's something to note that her cells have been able to travel all around the world, places that she never would have, as just a Black woman, never would have had the opportunity to go to, and in a way kind of have broken out of the structure. I don't know. I don't know if you've done any works or anything about Henrietta.
She comes up in the book, absolutely.
Okay.
As I was writing the book, Rebecca Skloot's Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks was, come out. But what's so interesting about, one, thinking about being, well, I was born in Baltimore, raised in Southern California. But what is always kind of known for those of us who have roots in Baltimore is that there is a contentious relationship between the Black community and Johns Hopkins. And so it's really telling that Johns Hopkins Hospital, and what's interesting is, like, right now I'm like A block. I'm actually within the campus right now. This is where I live, but there are, I'm in the middle of a block. I'm renting a space that's in a block that has not been bulldozed. Johns Hopkins has been buying up properties around its campus further out in Baltimore. And so that blight that Baltimore is so well known for, those blocks and blocks of boarded up row houses, many of them have been owned by Johns Hopkins. And it's intentional kind of benign neglect. And so it's interesting, if you look at health disparity maps in Baltimore, how Johns Hopkins Hospital sits in the reddest zone.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Right. And like, what to me, and that has everything to do with how Henrietta Lacks was accessible as subject and resource, and how my own experience in 2006 with Johns Hopkins was about the accessibility of where my grandparents live, which is in East Baltimore. And so, like, and we talk about institutions and medical racism, and how the teaching hospital can be situated in a place to make bodies available to it, right? I think Johns Hopkins is a really great example, as people are suddenly really surprised that it has been found out that Johns Hopkins himself was a slave owner.
Yeah, but like, how is that a surprise? Like, it's just right.
Right. And
right.
Entire Black community in Baltimore is like, yeah, probably, yeah.
Yeah.
That makes absolute sense.
Yeah, I remember I remember I had a clinic patient who developed this serious lung infection. It was a mycobacterial infection. And I was trying to find him, to tell him that, oh, you've got this, you need to take antibiotics. And, called him, he didn't pick up. And then, looked up his address, and I was like, oh, that's just a couple blocks from the hospital. So went out, wading through all of these boarded up houses and found the address. And I was like, this can't, somebody lives here? I don't believe it. I slipped a note under the door and he called. And I said, well, it floored me that within spitting distance of this world-class hospital, there are people living in deplorable conditions.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something that's tolerated.
It's something that's desired.
It's something that's
like, if we were really going to be honest about what, benefits institutions, right? And I would say, like, even in my like the part of Patient that is my own narrative that I don't necessarily talk about is the moment in which, like I was brought to my grandparents' home. I was in such incredible pain, and they're like, this is not normal for her, and called the ambulance. And one of the EMTs was like, okay, we'll take her to Johns Hopkins. And it was either my grandmother or my grandfather who asked if there was any other option. That is the relationship that this community has to Johns Hopkins. It's not like, Johns Hopkins is this beautiful beacon of something of medical greatness, and like it's a part of tracking COVID-19. Like, it's so much a presence in a kind of international medical community, in the community in which it is not a shining beacon on the hill.
No,
at all. It is not the hospital you want to end up in.
I wonder, we have a few minutes left. I encourage again people in the audience to submit questions, but what strikes me is the juxtaposition between your presentations on voice, on the notion of voice. What Ray says, I wanted to tell my story. And it was even the telling of it, the uttering of it, the putting it to voice that was prevented by the Ira Katznelsons and the Board of Trustees and the New York Times too, I guess. Whereas Bettina is finding very revolutionary ways to bring voice to the lives of others. And I'm just wondering how this voicing that the Black women's poetics is able to accomplish could in some way break the silence that Ray, as one example of many in trying to face these institutions.
Well, in my particular case, it's become clear to me there's a media blockade, and I attribute some of that to the fact that the president sits on the board of Graham Holdings, which at least at one time published Washington Post. But more importantly, that Columbia University issues the Pulitzer Prizes, and the president sits on the board of the Pulitzer Prizes. And what reporter wants to, offend the president and potentially ruin their chances at a Pulitzer? So I can tell you, I've been working at this for 8-9 months steady. And, we'll get a nibble from a reporter, and the moment you mention it's about Columbia, they just stop returning emails. I'll keep at it, but it's been nearly impossible.
Yeah. We do have a question about the moral mandate. The questioner says, I agree that we should not tell our horror stories to be heard or act as a moral code. This is referred to Bettina. Do you have suggestions and ideas for Black women who hope to affect change through their narratives?
I think when I critique the idea of there being a kind of moral mandate through Black women's stories, I'm not at all saying that Black women or Black folks or marginalized folks in any way should not tell them.
Mm.
I don't think that that is a place where we should have to start a conversation, because if we start there, then the logic brings us back. The logic that brought us to starting there will bring us back to where we began, right? We get caught up and desirous of the trauma. We start to seek it as a way of understanding medicine's missives, and we would consider them missives. We would think of them as being in the past. You know, we talk about Henrietta Lacks now for the way that we can distance ourselves from her by a generation, you know. But we don't necessarily consider the Esmeen Greens that was not too long ago, right? And, you know, the Dr. Susan Moores that was just a couple months ago, right? Like those things, you know, if we start there, then we've already buried someone. We've already missed the mark. And so I think this is what, you know, what I would ask for, or what I'm trying to think towards. And this is where this is still very much a brainstorming exercise with these writers, is to ask, or to work towards thinking otherwise, right? And I think where that starts in the kind of narrative form is to understand that as knowledge, to understand that as valuable, to understand Black women's self stories, marginalized folks' self stories as valuable information, not as entertainment, not as an addendum, not as an illustration, but the thing from which we can, the thing that matters, the as important as whatever is in someone's medical chart, as important as whatever the figures are in our textbooks, that we take that information up as quite seriously, and not as illustrations to the more serious business of medical science.
Yes. And also that it's not just a getting this off your chest. It's not just a cathartic effort to be freed from this story, but rather that it is told only because action has to happen. And I think that is what Ray has told us about so eloquently, that even when the trauma is voiced, it does not matter. We have one more question, and then I'm afraid we're going to have to close the evening. How are you managing your own holistic everyday health? What small acts of resistance do you prescribe for those of us looking to resist? So this is actually two questions in one. What do you prescribe for those of us looking to resist?
I think that's a question that has answers specific to whatever situation. I think and I can actually see how the questions could be understood into one, right? That understanding holistic self-care in a particular kind of way is a form of resistance, right? That's Audre Lorde tells us a bit of that. But I also think that our ethics of care need to be understood beyond the individual, right? And I think that's where, you know, the way that we talk about care, and the way that we talk about, I mean, even in the context of medicine, if the way that I'm reading folks talk about care, that, you know, Ray is the professional in this context, but is not necessarily holistic. And I think that to come to people as whole beings, and to understand that care involves a kind of community investment. It involves we have this example of Johns Hopkins. What is the ethic of care, where this incredibly rich institution that now we understand has its own roots in its wealth in enslavement, in the enslavement of Black folks, sits in this community, and yet this community has incredible disparities of wealth, of care, of health care. And I mean, and again, not to get to the way that there is community resistance against Johns Hopkins, there are whole clinics started up, startup clinics that say, don't go to Johns Hopkins, there, but because the idea is they don't care about you. So if there is actually a real, and not in a reach out way, but in a way that folks in this community have already done that work, even to the point of thinking about the history of Henrietta Lacks, Black folks had already been remembered and memorialized her. It's just that knowledge wasn't interesting enough for a mainstream. So a Rebecca Skloot has to come in and make that valuable to the rest of the world, right? And she talks about that. She talks about going to Black folks who had already started a museum, wrote about her, and how do we all know about her? A New York Times bestselling book by a white journalist. So I think, again, it's about those ethics of care, and what we value is knowledge. And it can't be an idea that, you're extending care. It has to be a true entrenched investment in communities that have already had to do the work of self-care.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you to the three of us. I'm afraid we have to stop now. We have undergone something together tonight in the conversations among the three of you about contestation, and about silencing, and about the opposite of silencing, and about the, again, epistemologies of aesthetics that are going to enable us somehow to get beyond where we are right now. I honor all of you three, and thank you very much on behalf of all of us here.
Thank you.
Much. Thank you, Ray. Thank you, Rita.